No matter what you're growing, there is one pest that pretty much hits it all, and it's a little hard to treat and see. That pest is called scale. So in this video, we are going to show you exactly how to ID, treat, prevent, manage scale, which is something that doesn't even sound like a pest. It sounds almost like a disease, but in fact, it is a pest. So we're going to go over to Chris up in Vancouver, BC to learn how to deal with this annoying pest.
Hey, it's Chris, and today I'm checking in on my plants to make sure that they're not harboring one of the more annoying pests that we commonly see in our gardens, on our houseplants, and in the greenhouse. Now, I'm referring to scale, or the insects in the superfamily Coccoidea. There are actually thousands of species of scale, so we can't really go into detail talking about them. But in today's video, we will go over how to spot, treat, and prevent these insects from quietly destroying your plants. Now, the tricky thing with identifying scale damage is that it can look like other things like poor nutrition or a virus where there's general poor health, weak growth, possibly malformations, and in bad infestations, there could be leaf color change or defoliation. But there is one symptom that gives us a clue that we're looking at scale infestation, which is the presence of sooty mold. And sooty mold is this general term used for black fungal growth found on plants that have honeydew, and not honeydew, the melon that we eat. I'm referring to honeydew, which is the sticky substance which is excreted from sap-sucking insects like scale, its relatives aphids, and also insects like leafhoppers. But sometimes we see other clues, which are waxy substances left along the plant leaves and stems. And when we see that, we need to be a little bit more serious when it comes to trying to identify what the heck is going on so that we can prevent any further damage and possibly a bad infestation. Now, the reason why scale can sometimes go undetected for a long period of time is because the insects are quite small. And that's why I pulled out my jeweler's loupe or a hand lens, because many of the species, the adults, are less than 1/8 of an inch, which is quite small, and the nymphs even smaller. And another reason why sometimes it's hard for us to identify scale is because as insects, they don't really look like the typical insects we know, like ants and grasshoppers with those segmented body parts. Scale is covered with this either soft covering or a hard armored coat. And actually this difference in covering describes two of the main scale families. We've got the soft scale, which is the Coccidae family, and the armored scale, which is the Diaspididae family. If you are familiar with mealybugs, they look a lot like soft scale, but they're actually their own family, the Pseudococcidae, even though they fall under the same superfamily, Coccoidea. We'll talk about them maybe another time because they are quite different from our scale friends. If you grow indoor tropical houseplants like those beautiful leafy foliage plants, or if you're like me and you grow subtropicals in a greenhouse, then you've likely come across soft scale insects. So they're a bit more oval in shape, they're lighter in color, and they have this downy, waxy covering all over their body, which is actually a part of the insect. Most of the adults are immobile for most of their lives, and they're wingless and legless, which sounds kind of creepy. And for most of the soft scale species, they are larger than other species of scale. Armored scales are a little bit harder to spot. They're generally smaller in size, and for the most part, their coloration is more like brown and beige, so they're well camouflaged when they're sitting on tree trunks or branches. Now, the shape or the texture can vary. Some look like barnacles, or some are actually quite flat and disc-like. Now, the one weird thing with the armored scale is that you can actually flick off this outer covering. So if you use a pin or your nail to flick it off, it's actually separate from the insect underneath. And another difference with armored scale is that it doesn't produce honeydew, or at least the same amount of honeydew that soft scale produces. So you're not going to find sooty mold when you're just dealing with the armored scales. Even though there are over 8,000 described species of scale, yes, that's a lot of scale, many of them follow this general life cycle where they hatch from underneath the female's protective covering sometime during the spring. And then they are going to emerge and disperse as these crawlers or these immature nymphs. So they have legs, they've got antenna, and they are out looking for a new feeding spot. So they're going to crawl, look for a spot, hunker down, and then they put their piercing mouth part into the plant and start feeding. Now, during this process, this is usually when most species will molt, lose their legs, and become immobile, and they will just keep on feeding for months. They'll enter the colder season, they'll overwinter, and come spring, they will kind of wake up as these adult females, and then the cycle will repeat itself again when those females have eggs. Fun fact, males are not required for the reproduction for many of the scale species. So yes, males are hatched from the eggs. They do develop wings, but they lack mouth parts, which is kind of weird. But they're actually only around for a few days, so I guess it really doesn't matter. So really what we are seeing on our plants as these adult scales are the females. For both soft and armored scale, we are trying to target the more vulnerable crawler stage, so those immature nymphs, because they haven't yet developed that outer protective covering. So once they're adults, it's really hard to get any sort of chemical control to penetrate through that outer covering. It is quite protective. So if we can get to the nymphs, it makes it a lot easier for us to control the population. And also, if we can catch them at this stage, it prevents wind from picking them up and dispersing them through our gardens, and also prevents us from brushing our sleeve up against plants and sharing it with our other houseplants. Now, before we reach for any sort of chemical controls like insecticide, we first want to determine the severity of the infestation. Now, if it's just a couple of scale insects here and there, you can try picking them off, squishing them, destroying them. And then you also want to isolate your plant away from your other plants, ideally away from your garden, and then monitor for new generations. If the plant looks to be okay and you don't see any more insects crop up, then it may be okay to reintroduce back into your collection. But if the infestation is really bad, let's say this whole branch was just covered with adult scale, then you want to prune off this branch and dispose of it. Now with your plant, you want to isolate it away from all other plants, and this is when you can reach for a chemical control of your choice, whether it's horticultural oil or neem oil or horticultural soap. For many of the soaps and oils, you would be spraying the product onto the plant. And the key here is to make sure that the product comes in direct contact with the insect. Otherwise, it's not going to be an effective treatment. And also be prepared to do multiple applications of the product. Instructions will be on the label because you want to catch all of those future generations to help really reduce the population of the pest. There are also biological controls for scale, like parasitoid insects, but those are mostly reserved for commercial uses, and it's not really practical for home-based use if you have scale. But if you have naturally occurring predators in your area and you don't want to use the chemical route, then it's good to look into what kind of insects would be affecting scale in your area, and then you can go ahead and plant plants that support those natural predators. Many gardeners know that by having good cultural practices like providing adequate light, water, nutrition, and regular maintenance makes a plant nice and healthy and able to withstand pressures from pests and also environmental stressors. But what you do at the nursery or garden center is actually the key to preventing scale, infestations, and damage to your plants. Although it's really tempting to go to the clearance rack of your garden center and rescue those sad plants and nurse them back to health, that's really the action that brings back a lot of pests into your collection and your garden. So try to avoid those if possible. What you want to do when you're shopping for plants is to inspect the plant, make sure that there's no weird discoloration or malformations, make sure that the plant actually is exhibiting those characteristics that make it a good specimen of that species. Also, if you want to check for scale, check underneath the leaves, along the stems. That's where those adults are going to be hanging out. If you suspect that your newly acquired plant baby did come into contact with scale or any other pests, then you do want to isolate your plant away from others for at least a few weeks. And during this period, you want to monitor for any new pest development, and that way you will prevent further infestations.
Hope you enjoyed the video. This season, we're going to be putting out a full guide to most pests. So no more hornworms on these tomatoes, no more cutworms on the corn, all that stuff. So make sure to subscribe. Good luck in the garden and keep on growing.